Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
We are reading more of our Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend. This is chapter 3, Between the 20th Century and the Longue Durée, Between the History of Marxism and the History of Russia, The Origins of Stalinism. We're getting into some history now. A catastrophe foretold. Just found out someone in chat converted an anarchist. Let's go, Gots. Good job. So far, we have concentrated on the interweaving of the ideological, political, and military contradictions of the revolutionary process on the one hand, and the international conflicts on the other. But the picture would not be complete if we did not also bring in the long-term dimension of the history of Russia. The approaching catastrophe had been felt by observers for most diverse orientations well before 1917, and even well before the formation of the Bolshevik Party. In 1811, in the St. Petersburg, still shaken by the peasant revolt led by Pugachev, and illiterate but with great political skills, which had been suffocated by, with some difficulty, a few decades earlier, Joseph de Maistre expressed the concern that a new European-type revolution might break out. This time, led by an intellectual class of popular extraction or sentiments, by a Pugachev of the university. By comparison, the upheavals that had taken place in France would appear as child's play in comparison. There are no expressions to tell you what one might fear, quote unquote. That's from Mastery. Let's just jump forward about half a century. A prophecy even more fitting. Indeed, positively amazing for its peasants. Its prescience can be read in an article on Russia by Marx, published in an American newspaper. Oh, this, I've talked about this. American newspaper, the New York Daily Tribune of January 17th, 1859. If the nobility continues to oppose the emancipation of the peasantry, a great revolution will break out. The reign of terror of these half-Asiatic serfs will be something unequaled in history, unquote. Yeah, I mean, Marx, he he came from Germany, so he had a way with words that reflected the time, but yeah. Okay, I want you to focus less on the part that the part there that he said, but the reign of terror that these serfs will unleash will be something unequaled in history, is what he said about Russia. And again, that is in 1859. Which, again, like, putting aside the fucking the very problematic one part of that statement, it was an accurate prediction. And this is and again, this is after he realized that he was probably incorrect in some aspects of his manifesto, which is why I talk about this all the time, which is why you see later versions of his manifesto, he changed his opinion, saying that the working class can't simply take hold of its existing state organs, Well, something else that he also realized later on is that revolution might break out in other places where capitalism has not yet fully been developed or highly developed. Yeah, Orientalism was just like, I mean, in Europe, it was just prominent in a way that Russophobia becomes. Which again, if Russophobia really does have like a basis in Orientalism and like a very close relation to it. Yeah, and I mean, and I mean, yeah. Again, at the same time, this could be like a tongue-in-cheek way that he's sort of like, talking about the way other people talk about those peasants. But again, that's because that's Marx's writing as well, very sarcastic. But again, like he has the attitude and the outlooks of like a guy in Russia in 18 whatever. He's just far beyond a lot of liberals today. Yeah, he was a very sarcastic person like that. It's and yeah, it's from Marx and Engels. That's why I always put the kappa. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure he would have used the kappa today. Okay. Anyway, but the important thing is, like I say, he's saying here, the reign of terror of these serfs will be something unequaled in terror in history. 1859. He said that about Russia. Immediately after the 1905 revolution, it was Russian Prime Minister himself, Sergei Witt, who stressed the unsustainability of the situation. He warned the Tsar of the danger represented by the Bund, the peasant revolt. Quote, the advance of human progress is unstoppable. The idea of human freedom will triumph, if not by way of reform, then by way of revolution. But in the latter, even it will come to life on the ashes of 1,000 years of destroyed history. The Russian Bund, mindless and pitiless, will sweep away everything, turn everything to dust. The horrors of the Russian Bund may surpass everything known to history. Unquote. So interesting how they're lamenting about it in that way, right? True conservative. Moreover, it was Witt himself who was involved in the ferocious repression with which the 1905 revolution and the often savage jacqueries that accompanied it were met. The Minister of the Interior, P.N. Durnovo, ordered, quote, the governors to proceed to the immediate execution of the rioters, to burn and raze to the ground the villages from which the riots originated. The military tribunals, the collective reprisals, the death squads, and the pogroms that fell on the Jews, accused of fueling subversion. It was a situation that lasted up to the outbreak of the war. It was that same Minister of the Interior himself who warned, quote, revolution in its most extreme form and irreversible anarchy will be the only foreseeable results of an ill-conceived conflict with the Kaiser. Unquote. So only not wanting war because, that would put the whole that would make revolution be at risk. That would make revolution a possibility. This is what came to pass in due course. Let's consider the picture that Russia presents on the eve of the ascension to power of the Bolsheviks. The myth of a country which, following the collapse of autocracy, was happily set on the road to liberalism and democracy, but is now fallen into crisis. It was a myth cultivated by Churchill, who, to justify his interventionist policy, accused the Bolsheviks, propelled by German gold, of having forcibly overthrown the Russian Republic and the Russian Parliament. It would be easy to accuse the English statesman of hypocrisy. He was well aware that between February and October, London had regularly supported coup attempts aimed at restoring Tsarist autocracy or imposing military dictatorship. It is Kerensky himself who had stressed that, quote, the French and British governments seized every opportunity to sabotage the provisional government, unquote. And yet, from his American exile, the Menshevik leader continued to cultivate the myth in question to the last, accusing the Bolsheviks of a double betrayal towards the fatherland and toward the newborn Russian democracy, quote unquote. Ah, you see the liberals? See them at work already? They equate revolution with a betrayal of democracy. With the end of World War II and the emergence of the USSR as a superpower, the charge of national betrayal became obsolete. Kerensky, however, was one of the few Menshevik leaders who clung to it. Indeed, beyond him, the Bolshevik betrayal of Russian democracy, culminating in the Stalinist terror, is still a commonplace motif. But this cliché does not withstand historical analysis. It is not just a question of the obstinacy of the leaders who emerged from the February days, and first and foremost of Kerensky himself, to perceive in carnage, which the overwhelming majority of the population is determined to bring to an end, a political line that can only be carried out by resorting to the iron fist and terror at the front and in the rear. Nor do the recurrent attempts to establish a military dictatorship, to which Churchill is anything but a stranger, constitute the main feature. There is much more, quote, the idea that the February days were a bloodless revolution, and that the violence of the crowd did not really take off until October, was a liberal myth. This is one of the most tenacious myths about 1917, but which has now lost all credibility. Let's look at how it actually unfolded. The crowd exacted a violent revenge against the officials of the old regime. Policemen were hunted down, lynched, and killed brutally. In St. Petersburg, in a few days, the number of dead amounted to 1,500, with the often furious lynching of the most hated representatives of the ancient regime. The most serious violence, however, was perpetrated by the sailors of Kronstadt, who mutilated and murdered hundreds of officials. The mutineers were the youngest recruits. The normal rules of naval discipline did not apply to them, and the officers had routinely treated these rookies, quote, with more than the usual sadistic brutality. Hence, they exacted revenge with an awesome fury. The situation deteriorated further in September, following General Levar Kornilov's attempted coup d'etat. Popular executions and assassinations were rampant, accompanied by unprecedented violence. Yes, officials were tortured and mutilated before being put to death. Eyes and tongue torn out, ears cut off, nails driven into epaulets, hanged upside down, impaled. According to General Brusilov, a large number of young officials committed suicide to escape a horrible death. On the other hand, methods of killing officers were so brutal, with limbs and genitals sometimes cut off or the victim skinned alive, that one can hardly blame the officer. Moreover, the fury was such that, even before October, In the resolutions of the Soviets, then largely dominated by socialist revolutionaries, anyone against the Soviets were stigmatized as enemies of the working people, the bloodthirsty capitalists, the bourgeois who suck the blood of the people. Unquote. On the other hand, the crisis of town-country trade, well before the Bolsheviks seized power, created a new, acute hotbed of violence. In the tragic situation created by the catastrophe of the war, the decline in agricultural production, and the hoarding of scarce food resources available meant the survival of city dwellers depended on very radical measures. Once again, even before the October Revolution, a minister who was a known liberal economist advocated the use of requisitioning by means of armed force in the event of market incentive failure. The fact was that the practice of requisition is common to all parties in conflict. The interweaving of these multiple contradictions causes a bloody anarchy, with the collapse of all authority and institutional frameworks, with the explosion of savage violence from below, of which the protagonists are first and foremost the millions of deserting and disabled soldiers, or disbanded soldiers, and with a general militarization and brutalization of social behavior and political practices. It was a level of brutalization incomparable to that known in Western societies. In order to understand this tragedy, one must keep in mind the process of spreading social violence from the areas of military violence, the contamination of the rear by the violence exercised by soldiers, peasants, deserters outside the framework of the army, by the millions of deserters from the decaying Russian army, the increasingly blurred boundaries between the front and the rear, between the civilian sphere and the military. In conclusion, the violence of the military zones spreads everywhere, and society as a whole was not only plunged into chaos and anarchy, but became prey to unprecedented brutalization. It is therefore a matter of starting from the First World War and the crisis and disintegration of the Russian army. In fact, it is perhaps worth proceeding even further back in time. The exceptional burden of violence that fell on Russia in the 20th century can be explained in light of the intertwining of two processes. The great jacquerie of the autumn of 1917, which had been smoldering for centuries, and which, for this very reason, unleashed a blind and indiscriminate violence against property and homes and the very lives of the owners, as well as a very strong resentment against the city as such. The second process was the disintegration of the Tsarist army, the largest army in history, 95% of which was composed of peasants. The oppression, exploitation, and humiliation of an endless mass of peasants at the hands of a small aristocratic elite which considered itself a stranger to its own people, who were degraded to a different and inferior race, was the harbinger of a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. All the more so because the First World War further exacerbated social conflict, in which aristocratic military officers exercised a daily power of life and death over the serf soldiers. It was not by chance that, at the first signs of crisis, they sought to maintain discipline at the front and in the rear by resorting to artillery. It's the collapse of the ancient regime was the moment of revenge and vengeance, which had been longed for and brooded over for centuries. This is self-critically acknowledged by Prince G.E.L. Vov. The revenge of the serfs was a settling of accounts with those who had for centuries refused to treat the peasants as people rather than dogs. Hey mama, welcome in, comrade. Shout out to mama. Follow mama and media, please. Unfortunately, just because it was a question of revenge, it took not only savage but also purely destructive forms. Thousands of drunken workers and soldiers were roaming through the city, looting stores, breaking into houses, beating up, and robbing people in the streets. Even worse was what happened in the countryside. Whole units of deserters took over regions in the rear and lived as bandits. Makhno! Ukrainian Black Army! Excuse me. The united agitation of deserter soldiers and peasants sparked a devastating fire in Russia. Under the banner not only of jacquerie, aristocratic houses were set on fire and their owners often killed, but also ludism, the agricultural machinery that in previous years had reduced the need to resort to wage labor, was destroyed. And vandalism, destroying and defacing anything like paintings, books, or sculptures that smacked of excess wealth. Yes, peasants vandalized manor houses, churches, and schools. They burnt down libraries and smashed up priceless works of art. No, I think it was just, I think I just tickled my nose something there. I'm not sure what it was. Just a little anti-authoritarian tickle there, that's all. The Russian state, preserved by those advocating the withering away of the state. Is what this part's called. On the whole, we can thus characterize the situation that was created following the February Revolution and the collapse of the ancient regime. Quote, Russia, in short, was being balkanized. If 1917 proved anything, it was that Russian society was neither strong enough nor cohesive enough to sustain a democratic revolution. Apart from the state itself, there was nothing holding Russia together. That's from Fidges. Ironically, it was a party that foresaw and hoped for the final extinction of the state, that reintroduced the state. Ruthless is the energy that is required to restore order in a world which, having been savaged by centuries of isolation and oppression, is undergoing a further process of barbarization following the war, the dissolution of the ancient regime, and the spreading anarchy and chaos. But it would be trivially ideological to see only one side resorting to terrorist violence. Let's see how the emerging new power is countered. Quote, this was a savage war of vengeance against the communist regime. Thousands of Bolsheviks were brutally murdered. Many were the victims of gruesome and symbolic tortures. Ears, tongues, and eyes were cut out. Limbs, heads, and genitals were cut off. Stomachs were sliced open and stuffed with wheat. Crosses were branded on foreheads and torsos. Communists were nailed to trees, burned alive, drowned under ice, buried up to their necks and eaten by dogs or rats, while crowds of peasants watched and shouted. Party and Soviet officers were ransacked. Police stations and rural courts were burned to the ground. Soviet schools and propaganda centers were vandalized. Simple banditry also played a role. Most of the rebel armies held up trains. In the Donbass region, such holdups were said to be almost daily occurrence during the spring of 1921. Gee, I wonder who's doing that in Donbass. Raids on local towns, and sometimes the peasant farmers were another source of provisions. Unquote. What brought about this savage violence? Was it the policy conducted by the Bolsheviks? Only in part. In 1921-22, there was a terrible famine, directly caused by a year of drought and heavy frosts. On the other hand, the peasant revolt was also a protest against a state of affairs that took away their only sons and horses for the army, one that prolonged the devastation of the Civil War, one that forced them into labor teams and robbed them of their food. That is, it was a protest against a catastrophe that had begun in 1914. Hey, Powerful Finger, welcome in, comrade. As far as Bolshevik policy is concerned, one must also be able to distinguish between measures which struck the peasantry in a senseless manner and others which were of an entirely different character. One thinks of the collective farms, which had already taken hold in 1920, and which were often made up of militant communists from the city, driven not only by their ideals, but also by the hunger that raged in the urban centers. People ate and worked in their collective teams. Women did heavy field work alongside the men, and sometimes nurseries were set up for the children. There was also an absence of religious practice. Even in this case, the hostility of peasants was unshakable, who believed that in the collectives, not only the land and tools were shared, but also wives and daughters. That everyone slept together under one huge blanket, unquote. On the other hand, even more bitter was the experience endured between the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century by the populace, who were determined to go to the people and help them by establishing cooperatives, but were quickly forced to revise the idealized image they had of the Russian peasant. Here is the fate that befell one of them, Mikhail Romas. Quote, "From the start, the villagers were suspicious of his cooperative. They could not understand why its prices were so much cheaper than other retail outlets. The richest peasants, who were closely linked with the established merchants, intimidated Romas and his allies. They filled one of his firewood logs with gunpowder, causing a minor explosion. They threatened the poor peasants, who began to show an interest in the cooperative, and brutally murdered one of his assistants, a poor peasant from the village, leaving his horribly mutilated body in several pieces along the riverbank. Finally, they blew up the cooperative along with half of the rest of the village by setting light to the kerosene store. These naive populace barely escaped with their lives." Unquote. Once again, the long-term nature of the violence is crisis-ridden. Once again, the long-term nature of violence in crisis-ridden Russia comes to the fore. This also applies to the horrific pogroms targeting Jews and Bolsheviks. One rationale for the persecution of the former being that they were suspected as puppeteers of the latter. Aha, that old Bolsheviks are Jews. The communists are the Jews. A lie, by the way, which is really one of the main sources of Hitler's anti-Semitism. Something to think about. An ideological feature, by the way, which the U.S. and Hitler had in common. In fact, even before Hitler came to power, the U.S. was already saying that the Bolshevik was the Bolsheviks and communist Russia were a Jewish plot. So that even predated the emergence of the Nazis as the state power in Germany. Just to point that out. In some places, such as Chernobyl, warning graphic, this part's graphic, for the next 5 minutes while I read this one section, just to warn y'all before I do this part. In some places, such as Chernobyl, the Jews were herded into the synagogue, which was then burned down with them inside. In others, such as Cherkasy, they gang raped hundreds of preteen girls. Many of their victims were later found with knife and saber wounds to their vaginas. The Terror Cossacks tortured and mutilated hundreds of Jews, many of them women and young children. Hundreds of corpses were left out in the snow for the dogs and pigs to eat. In the midst of this macabre scene, the Cossack officers held a surreal ball in the town post office, complete with evening dress and an orchestra, to which they invited the local magistrate and a group of prostitutes they had brought with them from Kherson. While their soldiers went killing Jews for sport, the officers and their boumonde drank champagne and danced the night away. Unquote. I wonder if Stalin was authoritarian enough. Again, though, this is still Lenin's time. This is still in the midst of civil war. Keep in mind, this is before the Bolsheviks had secured state power of the entire Russian territory, and you had bandits like Ukraine, like the Black Army, like Makhno. And those Jewish pogroms, as I pointed out before, were things that the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian Makovist army were engaged in. And when the anarchists say that the communists betrayed the anarchists in Ukraine, that's what they're talking about. Putting a stop to that entire situation. In this regard, a 1920 report of an investigation by the Jewish organizations in Soviet Russia talks of more than 150,000 reported deaths and up to 300,000 victims, including the wounded and the dead. Stalin and the conclusion of the Second Time of Troubles. The Russian Revolution now appears in a new perspective. Undoubtedly, the successes of the Bolsheviks in the Civil War was due, in the last analysis, to their extraordinary ability to build the state, an ability which their adversaries lacked. It was some of the declared enemies of the Bolsheviks in 1918 in Russia who drew attention to this point, even before modern-day historians were busy writing the Black Book of Communism. Pavel Milyukov recognizes the merit of their having known how to establish the state. Vasily Maklakov goes even further. Quote, "The new government has begun to restore the apparatus of the state, to restore order, to fight against chaos. In this field, the Bolsheviks show energy. I will say more, of an undeniable talent." Unquote. 3 years later, even in this ultra-conservative American newspaper, one could read, quote, "Lenin is the only man in Russia who has the strength to hold everything together. If he were overthrown, only chaos would reign." Unquote. Bizarre, huh? The revolutionary dictatorship that emerged from the October Revolution also fulfilled a national function. Gramsci understood this well when, in June 1919, he celebrated the Bolsheviks not only as the protagonists of the Great Revolution, but also for having demonstrated their revolutionary greatness by forming a ruling group of excellent statesmen, capable of saving the whole nation from the catastrophe into which it had been plunged by the ancient regime and the old ruling class. The following year, Lenin himself indirectly referred to this when polemicizing against extremism. He underlined that revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis, affecting both the exploited and the exploiters. It is the political force that proves capable of resolving such a crisis that conquers hegemony and achieves victory. This was the basis for supporting Soviet Russia for Alexei Brussilov, the brilliant general of noble birth who tried in vain to save his officers who were driven to suicide by the savage violence of the peasant rebels. My sense of duty to the nation has often obliged me to disobey my natural social inclinations." Unquote. A few years later, in 1927, in drawing a portrait of Moscow, Walter Benjamin sharply highlighted the strong national sense that Bolshevism has developed in all Russians without distinction. Soviet power had succeeded in imparting a new identity and self-consciousness to a nation not only terribly exhausted, but also somewhat dazed and adrift, lacking any stable point of reference. And yet, the crisis of the whole Russian nation was not quite over. Exploding in all its violence in 1914, but already with a long period of incubation behind it, it has sometimes been defined as a second time of troubles, analogous to that which raged in Russia in the 17th century. The struggle between the pretenders to the throne, which developed intertwined with the economic crisis and the peasant revolt, as well as with the intervention of foreign powers, sharpened in the 20th century as the conflict also arose between different principles of legitimation of power. To follow Weber's classical tripatriad typology, traditional power had followed the Tsar's family to the grave, even if this or that general had tried desperately to exhume it. Already cracked as a result of the bitter conflict that emerged in the Brest-Litovsk negotiations, charismatic power did not survive Lenin's death. Finally, rational legal authority faced extraordinary difficulties in enforcing its power after a revolution that promoted the ideology of the abolition of the state. This was especially so in a country with a long history of peasant hatred for the lords, which had traditionally been expressed through anti-state rhetoric and praxis. Insofar as a charismatic authority was still possible, it tended to take shape in the figure of Trotsky. Sorry. The brilliant there's that thing tickling me again. The brilliant organizer of the Red Army and the gifted orator and prose writer who claimed to embody the hopes and triumph of the world revolution. And from this, he derived the legitimacy of his aspiration to rule the party and the state. Stalin, on the other hand, was the embodiment of legal traditional authority, which was struggling to take shape. Unlike Trotsky, who came to Bolshevism late in life, Stalin represented the historical continuity of the party as protagonist of the revolution and hence holder of the new legality. Moreover, by affirming the realizability of socialism even in a single large country, Stalin conferred a new dignity and identity on the Russian nation, which could thus overcome the frightful crisis, ideal as well as material. It had suffered since the defeat and chaos of the First World War, thereby recovering its historical continuity. But precisely because of this, the adversaries cried betrayal, while traitors, in the eyes of Stalin and his followers, appeared to be those who, with their recklessness, by facilitating the intervention of foreign powers, were ultimately endangering the survival of the Russian nation, which was at the same time the vanguard of the revolutionary cause of the world. That's a Larry added footnote. The clash between Stalin and Trotsky was a conflict not only between two political programs, but also between two principles of legitimation. For all these reasons, the Second Time of Troubles ended not with the defeat of the supporters of the ancient regime, supported by the intervention of the counter-revolutionary powers, as is commonly believed, but with the end of the Third Civil War, which tore apart the Bolshevik leadership itself, and with the end of the conflict between the opposing principles of legitimacy. Thus, not in 1921, but in 1937. Although the time of troubles proper was left behind with the advent of the Romanov dynasty, the Russia of the 17th century had been finally consolidated with the ascension to the throne of Peter the Great. After going through its most acute phase in the years from the outbreak of the First World War to the end of the Andante intervention, the Second Time of Troubles ended with a strengthening of Stalin's power and the industrialization and westernization promoted by him in anticipation of the war. Exalted utopia and the prolongation of the state of exception. Of course, the long duration of the Second Time of Troubles is not only an objective fact. What role do the intellectual and political classes and the ideology that inspired them play in its prolongation? A current of thought that finds in Ardent the privileged point of reference is engaged above all in the search for the ideological original sin that would be proper to revolutions with the most tormented course. A different approach seems to be more fruitful, one that takes its starting point from the comparative sociology of the intellectual and political classes. In the movements that led to the revolution in France and Russia, we see at work the gos plumes, beggars of the pen, according to Burke's definition, or the Pugachev of the university, according to the definition of Maistre. In other words, it was a question of the non-propertied intellectuals, mocked as abstract by their adversaries. There is no doubt that the intellectuals of the property-owning class arrive at the appointment with the collapse of the ancient regime, already having behind them real political experience, and even the exercise of political power. In the United States, the slave owners, from whom the most eminent intellectuals and statesmen come, for 32 of the first 36 years of the life of North American Republic, the presidency was held by slave owners. Do not limit themselves to enjoying their wealth as a peculiar species of private property alongside the others. Over their slaves, they exercise a power that is at the same time executive, legislative, and judicial. Similar considerations could be made in relation to the England of the Glorious Revolution. Landed property, from which liberal intellectuals and leaders often came, is well represented in the House of Lords and Commons, or with the gentry, directly expresses the justices of the peace and thus holds judicial power. The appointment with power, on the other hand, sees the non-owning intellectuals much more unprepared. Their abstractness contributes to making the process of stabilizing the revolution more problematic and more tormented. There is, however, the other side of the coin. It is precisely this abstractness and this detachment from property that made it possible for the beggars of the pen to abolish slavery in the colonies, and gave the Pukachevs of the university and their vigorous impetus to the process of decolonization, which then developed on a planetary level. In the long duration of the Second Time of Troubles, there is no doubt that ideology also played a role. However, we must immediately add that it is not only the ideology of the Bolsheviks. We have seen the messianic expectations that accompanied the collapse of the Tsarist autocracy, and also know that the motive of the betrayed revolution went beyond the confines of Russia and the communist movement. A few months or a few weeks after October 1917, without wasting any more time, Kautsky points out how the Bolsheviks did not or were unable to fulfill any of the promises they had agitated at the time of their seizure of power. Oh boy. Here we go, Kautsky. Quote, "The Soviet government has already been constrained to make various compromises with capital. Even more than Russian capital, German capital will cause the Soviet Republic to recoil and recognize its claims. How far the capital of the Andante will again penetrate into Russia is still questionable. To all appearances, the dictatorship of the proletariat has only destroyed Russian capital in order to make room for German and American capital." Unquote. Fucking Kautsky. What can you say to that? What? Kautsky sent a silly letter. Can we even respond to it? The Bolsheviks had come to power promising the propagation under the impulse of the Russian experience of the revolution in the capitalist countries. But what finished off this prospect of outstanding boldness and fascinating glamour? It had been succeeded by a program of immediate peace at whatever price. This is in 1918, and paradoxically, Kautsky's critique of Brest-Litovsk is not very different from what we have seen from Bakurin in particular. Over and above international relations, even more catastrophic in Kautsky's eyes was the October Revolution's balance sheet on a more properly domestic level. Quote, "By the removal of the remains of feudalism, it has given stronger and more definite expression to private property than the latter had formerly. It has now made of the peasants who were formerly interested in the overthrow of private property in land, that is, the big estates, the most energetic defenders of newly created private property in land. It has strengthened private property in the means of production and in the produce." Quote unquote. And again, we are led to think of those who, even within the Bolshevik Party, brand the persistent private ownership of land and the NEP as a guilty abandonment of the socialist path. The subsequent collectivization of agriculture did not put an end to the denunciations of betrayal, which, on the contrary, as we know, precisely in the mid-1930s, found its organic formulation in the book by Trotsky, dedicated to, quote-unquote, "the revolution betrayed." But it is interesting to note that the fundamental indictments of this accusation are to some extent already present in Kautsky's 1918 book. Let's see how the eminent social democratic theorist argues. Quote, "If even individual private property is replaced by cooperative property, we must not forget that the latter is only a new form of capitalism. On the other hand, the same nationalization is not yet socialism, and not only because the market and the mercantile production continue to exist. There is something more. The liquidation of a particular form of capitalism does not mean at all the liquidation of capitalism as such. The new power can certainly destroy much capitalist property, but this is not yet the establishment of a socialist system of production. In fact, a new exploiting class has emerged or is emerging in the Soviet Union. In place of the former capitalists, now become proletarians. Will enter proletarians or intellectuals become capitalists? If even. What the fuck is going on there with Trotsky? Even if Trotsky, contrary to some of his more radical followers, prefers to speak of bureaucracy rather than of new capitalist class, the analogies between the two arguments compared here remain firm. All the more so since, even in the Russian revolutionaries' analysis of Soviet bureaucracy, seemed to set itself the goal of outdoing the Western bourgeoisie, quote unquote. Of course, there is no lack of differences. For Trotsky, it is the Bolshevik leadership as such that has abandoned and in some way betrayed the noble ideals of socialism. He's the pure socialist, like Noam Chomsky. Moreover, rather than a subjective and conscious choice and subjuration, such as abandonment, is the expression of the impotence of all revolutionary attempts made without regard to objective social and economic conditions, unquote. Compared to Trotsky's arguments appears more persuasive. The latter does not commit the naivety of explaining gigantic objective social processes, which beyond Russia also affect a whole series of other countries, thundering against the betrayal of a narrow political class or even of a single personality, who thus rises on the role of deus ex machina. There is, however, a moment when even the German Social Democrat leader brings in the category of subjective and conscious betrayal. The Bolsheviks are said to have consummated it when deliberately ignoring the immaturity of the objective conditions. They indulged in the call to force, which instead Marxism harshly condemns, quote unquote. It is only the initial choice to unleash the October Revolution that is synonymous with the abjuration of the noble ideals of Marx and socialism. In this case, however, the accusation of treason strikes Trotsky no less than Lenin and Stalin. It remains to be seen, however, whether Trotsky's condemnation of the Bolsheviks' cult of force is compatible with their reproach of having wanted a Brest-Litovsk immediate peace at whatever price. More important than the differences are the similarities that exist between the two theorists of Marxism compared here. In both speeches, the messianic vision of the future society digs a chasm between the beauty of authentic socialism and communism on the one hand, and the irremediable meritocracy of the present and of the reality on the other hand. They try to bridge this chasm by resorting, in Trotsky's case, to the category of betrayal, and in Trotsky's case, to the category of Russia's objective immaturity, which inevitably leads to the destruction and betrayal of their original ideals. Sounds pretty racist, but what do I know? In the eyes of the German Social Democratic leader, given an economically backward country that is not one of these leading industrial states, the failure of the socialist project is a foregone conclusion. What is being enacted there now is in fact the last of bourgeois and not the first of socialist revolutions. Fucking left comms are exhausting. Or social democrat, whatever this is, social democrats then, now they're left comms. This shows itself ever more distinctly. Its present revolution could only assume a socialist character if it coincided with socialist revolutions in Western Europe. Ah, yes. Again, not at all racist. And again, we are referred back to Trotsky's expectations and prospects. Again, racism. Like the idea that it couldn't be a real revolution unless it coincided with revolutions taking place in the West at the same time. Deeply wild thinking. Not only utopian thinking, but again, some basis in racism and like Western like chauvinism, which, like I say, that forms the basis of Trotsky's entire ideology. In fact, emerging as early as the February Revolution, the messianic vision of the new society to be built ended up being agitated in different and opposing ways by a very wide array of people. It is a dialectic that manifested itself with particular clarity on the occasion of their introduction of the NEP. It was not only important sectors of the Bolshevik Party who shouted out the scandal, and it was not always a concern for fidelity to Marxist orthodoxy that stimulated these cries within the Bolshevik Party. If the Christian thinker Pascal lamented the advent of the new aristocracy and the emergence of a process counter-revolutionary, the great writer Joseph Roth spoke of disappointment of the Americanization that sees Soviet Russia losing not only socialism, but its very soul, thus plunging into a spiritual void. To the cries of scandal for disappointment and betrayal, messianic expectations corresponded. In the bourgeois camp, the cries of triumph for the fact that, with the introduction of the NEP, even Lenin, so it was argued, was forced to turn his back on Marx and socialism. And again, we come across the category of betrayal, albeit declined this time with a positive value judgment. Funnily enough. Paradoxically, the Bolsheviks were pushed in the direction of a new revolution by a wide, very wide, and heterogeneous array of currents. The horror of the war had led Pascal to hope in apocalyptic tones as early as 1917 for a universal social revolution of unprecedented radicalism. On the opposite side, opponents and enemies of the October Revolution were ready to celebrate its failure every time in Soviet Russia an attempt was made to pass from the phase of messianic expectation to the less emphatic but more realistic phase of the construction of a new society. All this could not but reinforce the tendency already present in the Bolshevik Party, also as a consequence of the spiritual climate aroused by the war, to further radicalize the utopian motives of Marxist thought. In this sense, the ideology which contributed to the prolongation of the Second Time of Troubles was itself rooted in a concrete objective situation. Thank you for the clip, Ninja Can. I'm sure I will appreciate that. Okay, where am I at here? I'm just trying to see where we are. 124. I need to type this in chat so I don't forget. I just want to see how much is on this section, so I can try and time this thing. Not one of these is. It means govern. Oh, okay. I'm close. We're gonna go right to the end of this chapter, but I need to turn on this light behind me. Okay. From abstract universalism to the charge of treason. Hold your 840s. We're almost at the end of this. I kind of want to finish this. It's like 20 more pages. I can do that. Let us now take a general look at the terms in which the indictment against treason is articulated. If we want to formulate the problem in philosophical terms, we could say that, although they differ considerably from one another, and although they are formulated on the basis of very different ideological and political positions, these charges have in common a vision of universalism that we should now examine. Animated as Kollontai is by the need to oppose and overcome the domestic selfishness of the bourgeois family, which, by concentrating its gaze exclusively on its own inner circle, removes the tragedies which takes place outside it. Kollontai calls on communists to develop a feeling of universal responsibility, thus overcoming, also, as far as children are concerned, the distinction between yours and mine, and fighting together with ours for what is common to all, for what is ours. We have seen Trotsky rightly draw attention to a catastrophic consequences that are produced when parents ignore the particular responsibility they have for their children. And that is to say, by skipping the moment of the obligation of care for the circle of the closest relatives, without starting in the first place with a particular and inescapable obligation. The universal responsibility turns out to be empty and even becomes an instrument of evasion. In this sense, according to Lenin, Kollontai's theory was unsocial. But while they enforce it in relation to the issue of the family, the Bolshevik leaders tend to forget the unity of the universal and the particular when they deal with the national question. At the time of its foundation, the Third International starts from a presupposition of the International Party of the Proletariat, called upon to achieve the universal emancipation of humanity, without letting oneself be misled by so-called national interests, quote unquote. In an analogous way, we have seen Kollontai theorize a sort of universal family within which mine and yours are resolved without residue in ours. Subsequently, the Third International underwent an arduous learning process, which led it, with Dimitrov's report, to the Sixth Congress of 1935 to denounce as ruinous any form of national nihilism. But was not the rediscovery of the nation a betrayal of internationalism? If for Kollontai the persistence of the institution of family and special attention paid to one's own children are synonymous with selfish narrowness and disregard for the fate of all the children of the world, for Trotsky, to approach the prospects of social revolution within national boundaries means yielding to or indulging in social patriotism, and the social chauvinism co-responsible for the carnage of the First World War. So too, the idea of socialist development, which is occurring and even being completed in one country, is an essentially nationalist, reformist, and not revolutionary internationalist point of view, quote unquote. These are statements of 1928. 10 years later, the Fourth International was founded, which took up and further radicalized the abstract universalism of its beginnings, and therefore called itself the World Party of Socialist Revolution. Aha. Yaha. You see? You see the problem? And actually, this is something, by the way, that is criticized by Juche, by Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung, right? And it was criticized as basically like the Comintern and the Communist International basically taking too much of a central role, whereas the individual revolutions taking place everywhere were then like not as well respected as they should have been, which then allowed imperialists to come along and undermine certain revolutions in Eastern Europe with a false bourgeois nationalism based on Russophobia instead. If you want to read more about that or learn more about that, check out my reading in the same playlist that you found this work in, if you're watching this on my YouTube. In the same playlist, if you scroll up or go to a previous page, you'll see Foundations or Fundamentals of Revolutionary Party Building, in which Kim Jong-il gives those critiques of what went wrong with USSR. I read that a while ago. It would be easy to apply against Trotsky the criticism he made in his polemic with Kollontai. Just as it does not constitute a real overcoming of domestic egoism to ignore and evade the particular responsibilities one has towards one's children and closest kin, so it is by no means synonymous with internationalism to lose sight of the fact that the concrete possibilities and tasks of revolutionary transformation are to be found in the first place on a definite national terrain. The detachment or indifference toward the country in which one lives may well take on a significance that is anything but progressive. In Tsarist Russia, Herzen, an author dear to Lenin, pointed out that the aristocracy was far more cosmopolitan than the revolution. Far from having a national basis, its domination rested on the denial of the very possibility of a national basis, on the deep division between the civilized classes and the peasantry, quote unquote, between a very narrow elite inclined to pose as a superior race on the one hand and the vast majority of the population on the other. Without dismissing the racialization of the subaltern classes, and without affirming the idea of nationhood and national responsibility, one is not a revolutionary. Yep. I see. If only it was not as easy, as strict adherence to dogmatism, this thing would be over, but no, it's not. Yep. Exactly. And of course that becomes the problem because it's so easy to fall into that dogmatism. And that is, of course, why I say study Juche. Stalin was well aware of this, as is particularly clear from a speech he made on February 4th, 1931. He presented himself on this occasion as a revolutionary and an internationalist leader, who was both a statesman and a Russian national leader, committed to solving the problems that the nation had been dragging along for some time. Quote, "We Bolsheviks, who have made 3 revolutions, who have emerged victorious from bitter civil war, must also take on the problem of overcoming Russia's traditional industrial backwardness and military fragility. In the past, we had no fatherland, nor could we have had one. With the overthrow of the ancient regime and the advent of Soviet power, national nihilism is more senseless than ever. The cause of the revolution is at the same time the cause of the nation. The emphasis now seems to shift from class struggle to national economic development. But more exactly, in the concrete political situation that had arisen, the class struggle was configured as the effort to develop the socialist country economically and technologically, and thus enabling it to face the terrible challenges on the horizon, and to make real contribution to the internationalist cause of emancipation. The class struggle not only takes on a national dimension, but seems to configure itself in Soviet Russia as a trivial and prosaic task. In the period of Reconstruction, technique decides everything, and therefore it is necessary to study technique and to master science. Spilled bag, resubbing. In reality, this new task is no less difficult and glorious than the conquest of the Winter Palace. Bolsheviks must master technique and become experts themselves. Admittedly, this is far from an easy goal to achieve, but there are no fortresses that the Bolsheviks cannot capture. The policy that later presides over the Great Patriotic War finds its first formation in the years when Soviet Russia is engaged in a gigantic effort to industrialize and strengthen national defense. We saw Stalin stress, on the eve of Hitler's aggression, the need to link national feelings with the notion of a homeland. a healthy, properly understood nationalism with proletarian internationalism. In the concrete situation that had arisen following the expansionist offensive of the Third Reich, the march of universality passed through the concrete and particular struggles of peoples determined not to allow themselves to be reduced to the condition of slaves in the service of Hitler's master race. It was the resistance of the nations most directly threatened by the enslavement plans of Nazi imperialism that made internationalism advance in reality. But already 3 years earlier, it was in confirmation of the fact that we are in the presence of a learning process favored or imposed by the concrete necessity of developing national resistance struggles against imperialism. Mao Zedong had declared, quote, "To separate internationalist content from national form is the practice of those who do not understand the first thing about internationalism. We, on the contrary, must link the two closely. In this matter, there are serious errors in our ranks, which should be conscientiously overcome." Unquote. In similar terms, Gramsci distinguished cosmopolitanism and an internationalism which knows and must know how to be at the same time profoundly national. In addition to the disavowal of the nuclear family and the theorization of a kind of collective paternity and maternity, our children, and the general political level abstract universalism makes itself clearly felt in the theorization of a collective kinship leadership, seen once again in the dilution of individual responsibilities and individually assumed assignments. It is no coincidence that Kollontai was for some time a member of the workers' opposition, whose watchwords at the level of the factory and the workplace, the party and the trade union, and the administration and the state were, quote, "power of a collective body, collective will, common thought, and collective management," unquote. The messianic expectation of the complete disappearance of the distinction between mine and yours should be placed in this context, even in the economic sphere, with the consequent condemnation, rather than of the determinate system of production and distribution of social wealth, of the money economy and the market as such, of private property as such, however limited and restricted it may be. In all these cases, the universality coveted is that which presents itself immediately in the pristine purity, without passing through the mediation of and interweaving with particularity. And it is this cult of abstract universality that cries betrayal whenever particularity sees its rights or strength recognized. The dialectic of revolution and the genesis of abstract universalism. See, I disagree, Frank. I don't think I do disagree with you on that. But I'm in the middle of I am recording this for my YouTube. Okay, I'm gonna pause my recording. The dialectic of revolution and the genesis of abstract universalism. But how to explain the emergence of a vision and a purism so naive, at first sight, and so devoid of any sense of reality? No less naive and no less unrealistic would be to put everything on the account of this or that single personality. In reality, an objective dialectic is at work here. In the wake of the struggle against the inequalities, privileges, discrimination, injustice, and oppression of the ancient regime, and against the particularism, exclusivism, meanness, and selfishness reproached against the old ruling class, the most radical revolutions are led in order to express a strong, exulting, and even empathetic and melancholant vision of the principles of equality and universality. It is a vision which, on the one hand, with the impetus and enthusiasm it implies, facilitates the overthrow of the old social relations and the old political institutions. On the other hand, it makes the construction of a new order more complex and problematic. To what extent will it live up to its promises, ambitions, and expectations that led to its birth? Does it not itself run the risk of reproducing in a new form the distortions so passionately denounced in the ancient regime? The transition is all the more delicate because of the fact that the most radical revolutions, on the one hand, cultivate ambitious projects of social political transformation, and, on the other, precisely because of their extraneousness and remoteness from the existing order, see the coming to power of ruling classes without solid political experience behind them, who, moreover, find themselves in the need to not only create a new political order, but also a new social order. In these situations, it becomes clear what separates a sincere and meaningful political plan from empty promises. A concrete utopia, which, while remote, serves as a guiding vision for real change, can be distinguished from an abstract and misleading utopia, which ultimately serves as an excuse to avoid dealing with reality. For a revolution to be victorious, not only in the short run, but also in the long run, it must be able to give a concrete and lasting content to the ideas of equality and universality, on the wave of which it came to power. And in doing so, the new ruling group is called upon to purify those ideas of the naive form they tend to take in moments of enthusiasm. And it is called upon to carry out this work of purification not in an empty and aseptic space, but in a historically filled space, in which the economic and political compatibilities, the relations of force, the contradictions and conflicts that inevitably emerge make their presence and weight felt. It is in the course of this difficult transition that the Revolutionary Front, until then at least apparently characterized by its choral unity, begins to show its first cracks or tears, and then disappoints, disillusionment, and accusations of betrayal intervene. Hey, Radisby, welcome in. It is a process and a dialectic which Hegel analyzes with great lucidity and depth in relation to the French Revolution. It develops by waving the banner of the universal subject and the universal will and the universal consciousness. In this phase, at the moment of the destruction of the ancient regime, is the doing away with the various distinct spiritual spheres and the restricted and confined life of individuals. All social ranks or classes, which are component spiritual factors into which the whole is differentiated, are effaced and annulled. It is as if the society, having dissolved all intermediary social bodies, has completely disarticulated itself into a great mass of individuals who, rejecting all traditional authorities, are now devoid of legitimacy. They demand not only freedom and equality, but also to be able to participate in public life, and in every phase of the decision-making process. On the wave of this enthusiasm and exaltation, in a situation in which it is as if authority and power as such were suspended in nothingness, an anarchoid messianism emerges, which demands absolute freedom, and is ready to now denounce as any betrayal, any condemnation of, and restriction to universality, real or presumed. A new order presupposes a redistribution of individuals into spiritual spheres, into social organisms, into intermediary bodies, albeit construed and organized according to different and new modalities, respectful of the principles of the revolution. However, any new articulation of society, whatever it may be, appears as a negation of universality in the eyes of the anarchoid messianism. In fact, the activity of being of individual personality, would, however, find itself by this process confined to a branch of the whole, to one kind of action and existence, and therefore, when placed in the element of existence, personality would bear the meaning of the determinate personality. It would cease to be in reality universal self-consciousness. Unquote. This is an enlightening analysis of the dialectic that develops in the wake of the French Revolution, but also, and even more clearly, of the October Revolution, when the pathos of universality is felt even more strongly, both in its most naive and in its most mature forms. In the situation of exalted universalism, which presides over the overthrow of the ancient regime, every division of labor, however articulated, becomes synonymous with exclusivism, of seizure of universal self-consciousness and universal will by a bureaucratic and privileged minority. This is true for social relations and for political institutions. No existing order can fulfill the anarchoid messianist desire for an immediate and unmediated realization of universality. The way in which anarchoid messianism poses itself emerges clearly once again from the memorable pages of the phenomenology of spirit. Thank you, Larry. Quote, neither by the idea of submission to self-imposed laws, which would assign to it only a part of the whole work, nor by it being represented with when legislation and universal action takes place, does self-consciousness here let itself be cheated out of the actual reality. The fact that itself lays down the law and itself accomplishes a universal and not a particular task. For in the case where the self is merely represented and ideally presented, there is not actual. Where it is by proxy, it is not. Unquote. We are reminded at this point of the workers' opposition. Definition of bureaucracy in Soviet Russia. Quote, when someone else decides your fate. Unquote. Against this inadmissible expropriation is claimed a direction that is collective in every single phase of the decision-making process, with the consequent condemnation of any representative body. Even more so, on closer inspection, it is often, as we know, every project of constitutional order and even of legal regulation that is targeted, branded a priori as an attempt to enchain or shatter the universality, and therefore as an expression in the final analysis of an ancient regime that is hard to kill. To pass into a deed, to achieve reality and efficacy, and become actual concrete will, Hegel continues, universality must find expression in concrete individuals. It must put an individual consciousness in the forefront. But here is where messianism and anarchism cry scandal. Thereby, however, all other individuals are excluded from the entirety of this deed, and have only a restricted share in it, so that the deed would not be a deed of real universal self-consciousness. Unquote. The tragedy of the French Revolution, but also, and on a larger scale, the October Revolution, consists in this. If it wants to avoid being reduced to an empty phrase, the pathos of universality must give itself a concrete and determined content. But it is precisely this concrete and determined content that is perceived as a betrayal. On closer inspection, it is particularity as such that is branded an element of contamination and negation of universality. As long as this vision continues to prevail, the liquidation of the old regime is not followed by a construction of a new concrete order. Quote, universal freedom can thus produce neither a positive achievement nor a deed. There is left for it only negative action. It is merely the rage and fury of destruction. Unquote. What's interesting about that is this actually relates to the leadership theory in DPRK and why they don't reject like naming Kim Jong Un as the current leader, the current representative of the revolution that is unfolding right now in DPRK. It's why they don't shy away from that or shy away from Kim Jong Un being that core of the core of unity, which represents not Kim Jong Un an individual, but the whole Korean nation united around one purpose and one cause. So I just found that was interesting the way he mentioned Hegel there. Which I talked about that before too. Abstract universalism and terror in Soviet Russia. In Hegel's analysis, insofar as the terror is the result of the objective situation, but is not the result of an objective situation, but of an ideology. It must be put on the account, in the first place, of anarchoid messianism, of abstract universalism, which, in its flight from every particular and determinate element, succeeds in expressing itself only in the fury of destruction. As far as the Bolshevik Revolution is concerned, one must not lose sight of the permanent state of exception caused by imperialist intervention and encirclement. The more properly ideological component of the terror, on the other hand, refers to the cult of universality and of abstract utopia, which hampers the action of the new ruling group and ultimately causes its splits. It is interesting to see how, in the mid-1930s, Trotsky, having left behind the wise criticism of Kollontai, mocks Stalin with the rehabilitation of the family. Quote, while the hope still lived of concentrating the education of new generations in the hands of the state, the government was not only unconcerned about supporting the authority of the elders, and in particular of the mother and father, but on the contrary, tried its best to separate the children from the family in order to thus protect them from the traditions of a stagnant mode of life. Only a little while ago, in the course of the first 5-year plan, the schools and the communist youth were using children for their exposure, shaming, and in general, re-educating of their drunken fathers or religious mothers. With what success is another question. At any rate, this method meant a shaking of parental authority to its very foundations. Trotsky. Unquote. That's why Lenin said, and this is, by the way, that right there, it is the cause of my favorite quote against Trotsky, which I'll show you later. But that quote that he just read right there is what led to the Kusin quote against Trotsky. I'll just grab it for later. It's funny. This one, Otto Weil Kutzen. We'll save that for after the read. It led to that little dig that he did at Trotsky though. Because everybody was like, because a bunch of people pointed out like this seems a contradiction of previous positions, as this book is pointing out as well here. But I'll read that to you after. By contributing to a diffusion of a stagnant mode of life, and thus of the ideology and particularism of the ancient regime, the family is identified as an obstacle that the march of universality is called upon to smash or break down. The denunciation of parental authority produces not a decrease, but an increase in violence. The same result is produced by the condemnation of the Constitution and of law as such as instruments of bourgeois domination. On the basis of these assumptions, it is impossible to realize, or even to think of a socialist state based on the rule of law. There is, of course, a contradiction between the homage paid to the ideal of the extinction of the state and the call for the state to intervene even in the sphere of family relations. But it is the contradiction that invariably manifests itself between the libertarian rhetoric of abstract universalism and the practices of violence that it ends up stimulating. At this point, we are obliged to make further consideration. The tendency to see in the particular as such an element of disturbance or condemnation of universality is manifested well beyond the Bolshevik leadership. One thinks of the dividends or hostility with which Rosa Luxemburg generally viewed the national movements, which were accused of neglecting the international cause of the proletariat. After the October Revolution, the great revolutionary, on the one hand, criticizes the Bolsheviks for their failure to respect democracy or their supposed liquidation of it, and on the other invites them, quote, to nip separatist tendencies in the bud with an iron hand, unquote, coming from non-historic people whose rotted corpses rise from centuries-old graves, unquote. And now, let us see how Stalin describes the effects of the socialist revolution on the national question. Quote, by stirring up the lowest sections of humanity and pushing them onto the political arena, it awakens to new life a number of hitherto unknown, little-known nationalities. Who could have imagined that the old Tsarist Russia consisted of not less than 50 nations and national groups? The October Revolution, however, by breaking the old chains and bringing a number of forgotten peoples and nationalities onto the scene, gave them new life and a new development, unquote. Here we come to a paradoxical result, at least from the point of view of the usual historical balances and ideological stereotypes dominant today. With regard to the people who rise from centuries-old graves, according to Luxemburg's language, or of the forgotten peoples, according to Stalin's language, it's the former who manifests a more threatening and more repressive attitude. Naturally, as far as the judgment of who really exercised power is concerned, it is a question of seeing if and to what extent the praxis corresponded to the theory. The fact remains that it is Luxemburg's abstract universalism which reveals itself to be potentially more charged with violence, and which, throughout its evolution, has shown itself to be inclined to read national claims as a deviation from the high road of internationalism and universalism. We arrive at a similar result if, still on the subject of the national question, we compare this time Stalin and Kautsky. The theory formulated by the German Social Democratic leader, according to which the victory of socialism in a country or groups of countries would dilute or tend to dilute national differences and particularities, and indeed, the process was already beginning in developed democratic bourgeois societies. Oh dear. Stalin objects. Such a view, which superficially ignores the stability possessed by nations, finally opens the door wide to the war against a national culture, of national minorities or oppressed peoples, to the policy of assimilation and colonization, to the policy dear, for example, to the Germanizers and Russifiers of Poland. Again, it is a universality incapable of embracing the particular that stimulates violence and oppression, and to move us always within the realm of comparing indifferent theoretical enunciations. Kautsky turns out to be far more affected than Stalin by this abstract universalism. Like the German Social Democratic leader, Luxemburg also harshly criticized the Bolsheviks for their petit bourgeois land reforms, which gave land to the peasants. This view can be contrasted with that of Bekurin, according to whom, in the conditions of Russia at the time, with the monopoly of political power firmly in the hands of the Bolsheviks. Oh shit. Like the German Social Democratic leader, Luxemburg also harshly criticized the Bolsheviks for their petit bourgeois land reforms, which gave land to the peasants. This view can be contrasted with that of Bakunin, according to whom, in the conditions of Russia at the time, with the monopoly of political power firmly in the hands of the Bolshevik, it was precisely the private interest and the drive for enrichment of the peasantry and other social strata that could have contributed to the development of the productive forces and ultimately to the cause of socialism and communism. A significant change took place in Bakunin if, on the occasion of the Brest-Litovsk, with regard to the national question, he had demonstrated abstract universalism. Now, on the other hand, in relation to the NEP and the agrarian question, the process of constructing universality is also called upon to advance through the appropriate use of particular interests. We're in the presence of a learning process and a self-critical reflection of extraordinary interest, which helps us to understand what in our day is happening in countries like China and Vietnam. Bakunin thus continues, quote, "We imagine things in the following way. We assume power, we take almost everything into our hands, we immediately set a planned economy in motion. It does not matter if difficulties arise, we partly eliminate them, partly overcome them, and the thing ends happily. Today we see clearly that the matter is not resolved in this way." Unquote. To claim to organize production by means of orders coercively leads to catastrophe. Overcoming this caricature of socialism, communists are forced to take into account the enormous importance of individual private incentive for the finance and development of the productive forces, and it is understood for a development of the productive forces that leads us to socialism and not to a full restoration of so-called healthy capitalism. He showed instead, as Trotsky and the opposition did, about the degeneration of Soviet Russia because of the persistence of the private economy in the countryside and the class collaboration of the communists with the peasants, which we talk about a lot on here, and with the bourgeois strata tolerated by the NEP, would have led to a collapse of the civil peace and to a gigantic St. Bartholomew's night. It was Bakunin's defeat, determined only by the need to accelerate the industrialization of the country as much as possible in anticipation of the war, or did the irreducible hostility to all forms of private property, to the mercantile economy, also contribute to it? This is a problem we shall deal with later. We can already fix one firm point. The concentrationary universe reached its zenith on the wave of the forced collectivization of agriculture, and of the iron fist against the bourgeois and petit bourgeois tendencies of the peasants, members, for the most part, of non-historic peoples, quote-unquote. To the unfortunate language Luxemburg takes from Engels. God, she does that sometimes, doesn't she? Sorry. Luxemburg's term was non-historic people for some of that peasantry. And again, I mean, this is again why I say, like, this is it. I'm sorry, but this is why, Stalin was against the idea of just being able to expropriate, and I still am, like, small producers and petit bourgeois because they are small business owners. Again, as Nabil and I talked about on Monday, you have to consider that large numbers of colonized people, large numbers of marginalized people are forced into petit bourgeois dealing, like bead making, whatever else. Bead making, basket making, all kinds of other things, right? Handicrafts, small business type situations because they are left out of any other forms of work. And it's not just like First Nations people, black people too. Immigrants who come over as well face similar issues if they are not from, the more favored immigrant sections, European, that is. So yeah, I think that is an important point that we need to make and we need to understand that those people who, we might are petty bourgeois, many of them are on our side, right? And many of them are even from colonized communities. And here you have an example of Luxembourg calling them non-historic people because they're petty bourgeois peasants. That's why Stalin called that a criminal course. So, sorry, I got distracted by that. By that particular one. Hey, Lennon, welcome home. Yeah, just say, we can already fix one firm point. The concentration era universe reached its zenith on the wave of the forced collectivization of agriculture, and of the iron fist against the bourgeois and petit bourgeois tendencies of the peasants, members, for the most part, of non-historic people, quote unquote, to use the unfortunate language Luxembourg takes from Engels. Beyond the errors or brutality of this or that political leader, there is no doubt about the baleful role played by the universalism incapable of subsuming to the and respecting the particular. Yeah, exactly, Mana. The pages we have used of Hegel, the author in whom Lenin discerns germs of historical materialism, are like the advanced referations of the explanations of Stalinism. Ooh, that's a juicy little thing to say. The pages we have used of Hegel, the author in whom Lenin discerns germs of historical materialism, are like the advanced refutation of the explanations of Stalinism contained in the so-called secret speech of 1956, delivered at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It would, of course, be unfair to expect Khrushchev to live up to Hegel's standards. But it is peculiar that the tragedy and horror of Soviet Russia continues to be placed on the account of a single personality, indeed, a single scapegoat, as if there had never been the extraordinary analysis of the phenomenology of spirit devotes to the absolute terror and to the absolute freedom and terror. That was a good little dig at Kotsky. That was a good little dig at Khrushchev. Okay, I think this is the last little part right here. I do believe 135. Yep. Here we go, last little section. What it means to govern. A tormented learning process. Let us return to the Hegelian analysis of the dialectic of the French Revolution, and of the great revolutions in general. Starting from the concrete experience of the ruinous consequences to which the fury of destruction leads. Individuals understand the need to give a concrete and particular content to universality, putting an end to the mad pursuit of universality in its immediacy and purity. By renouncing absolute egalitarianism, individuals accept again negation and difference. That is, the organization of the spiritual masses, in which the multitude of individual consciousness is articulated. These, moreover, return to a restricted and appointed task, but thereby to their substantial reality. That is to say, we can now understand the inconclusive and ruinous character of the myth of the universal will, to use the language this time not of Hegel, but of quite a few Russian revolutionaries, of a direct democracy, of a collective leadership, which, without mediations and bureaucratic obstacles, expresses itself directly and immediately in the factories, in the workplaces, in the political bodies. As we can see, more than Jacobinism, Hegel's target is radicalism and anarchoid messianism, which is confirmed by the considerations he makes about another great revolution, namely the Puritan Revolution that invaded England in the mid-17th century. By putting an end to the period of inconclusive religious and pseudo-revolutionary exaltation, by giving a positive political outcome to a long years of travail, Cromwell shows that he quote, knew what it meant to govern. He took with a strong hand the reins of government, dissolved away that parliament that poured out in prayers and held with great splendor the throne as protector, unquote. Knowing how to govern here means being able to give concrete content to the ideals of universality that presided over the revolution, clearly distancing oneself, as far as the First English Revolution was concerned, from the followers of the Fifth Monarchy, the empty utopia of a society deprived and not in need of legal norms, due to the fact that individuals are enlightened and allow themselves to be guided by grace. To the extent that he was able to distance himself from abstract and inconclusive utopia, Robespierre also showed that he somehow knew or wanted to learn the art of government. After a great revolution, especially when its protagonists are from propertyless, ideological, and political social classes, and therefore lacking the political experience associated with the enjoyment of property, learning to govern means learning to give concrete content to universality. But notably, it involves a learning process. As far as the socialist revolution is concerned, it neither begins nor ends with Stalin. On the contrary, the most serious limit of this statesman, but also to a different extent of the other statesmen who still today refer to socialism, is to have left this learning process unfinished, or seriously unfinished. Let us take the national question. In Lenin, we can read the thesis according to which the inevitable merging of nations and of national differences, including linguistic ones, passes through the transitional period of the full and free unfolding of nations and of different languages, cultures, and identities. At least, as far as the transitional period is concerned, the awareness that the universal must be able to embrace the particular is clear here. A significant learning process has already begun. We are already beyond the abstract universalism, which makes itself felt, for example, in Luxemburg's thesis, for whom national particularities are in themselves the negation of internationalism. As far as the national question is concerned, Lenin only seems to grasp the unity of universal and particular in relation to the transitional period. Stalin is at times more radical. And actually, before I read this quote by Stalin, on that note, something funny experience I had actually with the Communist Party of Canada. One of the very early red flags for me when I first started organizing with them was we were meeting and talking about Marxist-Leninist theory, and like the people who were in my cell were trying to judge and gauge where we were at. And, we were all talking, and a bunch of us who were there, a bunch of us from colonized communities were there. And we were talking about, DPRK in Korea, and we also were talking about Stalin and the national question. And one of the old hats there, one of the old, cell leaders, settler, white guy, pipes up, right, and says, oh, if you think Stalin's national question is not nearly as good as Lenin's. It's not nearly as concrete or as informative as Lenin's. And I mean, all of us were like, "Oh, okay then. All right, cool." And he's saying this as if, none of us have already read Lenin's national question. And so afterwards, we're all leaving, and we're all like, what the fuck is this guy on? Like, Stalin improved and was more radical on the national question than Lenin, because Stalin himself, of course, talked about this before, had a more direct experience with colonization coming from Georgia. He was a colonized person, right? Which is why I do think that Lenin's national question is much better and much more in line with what we're the particulars of decolonization. Whereas Lenin, he does support decolonization as a universal, but as this points out, he only recognizes the particular in the transitional period, which becomes a problem. Yeah, Stalin's national question I find is fantastic. Oh, I said Lenin? Okay, I meant to say Stalin, sorry. Whereas Stalin's national question is like more in line with just the experience of what decolonization is in practice, including before socialist revolution is realized. Whereas again, Lenin has more of a universal approach. While it's good, Stalin's is just more in depth. But I found that was an early red flag for the Communist Party there for me. Some people, Kautsky for instance, talk of the creation of a single universal language and the dying away of all other languages in the period of socialism. I have little faith in this theory of a single all-embracing language. Experience, at any rate, speaks against rather than for such a theory, says Stalin. Judging from this passage, communism should not be characterized by a single all-embracing language, but it is as if Stalin is afraid of his courage. Mostly, he prefers to postpone the merging of nations and the formation of one common language to the time when socialism will have triumphed worldwide. Perhaps only in his last years of his life, when he is by then an indisputed authority within the international communist movement, does Stalin prove himself bolder. He does not merely reiterate forcibly that history shows that languages possess greater stability and a tremendous power of resistance to forcible assimilation, unquote. Now, the theoretical elaboration goes further. Quote, language is radically differs from the superstructure. It was created not by some one class, but by the entire society, by all the classes of the society, by the efforts of hundreds of generations. So, it is absurd to speak of a class character of language. So then, why should national languages vanish? And why then should nations as such vanish? It is true that linguistic commonality is one of the most important distinguishing marks of a nation, and yet, despite everything, orthodoxy finally prevails. Communism continues to be thought of as the triumph of the common international language, and ultimately of one nationality. At least, as far as this mythical final stage is concerned, the universal can again be thought of in its purity, without the contamination of the particular of languages or national identities. This is not an abstractly theoretical problem. Attachment to orthodoxy has certainly not contributed to an understanding of the permanent contradictions between the nations that call for socialism and that consider themselves committed to the construction of communism. It is the contradictions that have played a leading role in the process of crisis and dissolution of the socialist camp. In other areas of social life, we also see Stalin engage in a different struggle against abstract utopia, and then stop halfway in order not to compromise traditional orthodoxy. Even in 1952, and thus on the eve of his death, he felt obliged to criticize those who wanted liquidation of the mercantile economy as such. In contrast with this, Stalin judiciously observes, "It is said that commodity production is bound to lead to capitalism, all the same under all conditions. That is not true. Not always, and not under all conditions. Commodity production must not be identified with capitalist production. They are two different things." Unquote. There can well be a mercantile production without capitalists. And nevertheless, even in this case, orthodoxy proves to be an insurmountable barrier. The disappearance of the mercantile economy is postponed until the moment when all the means of production will really be collectivized, with the overcoming, therefore, of the cooperative property itself. Finally, with perhaps the decisive problem, we have seen Stalin theorize a third function, beyond repression and class struggle, on the domestic and international levels. A great jurist was right to point out that the report on the 19th Congress of the CPSU puts us in the presence of a radical change in the doctrine developed by Marx and Engels. It was a change that Stalin was arriving at, starting from his experience of government, from a concrete learning process that had already left traces in the thought and political action of the late Lenin, but which was now taking further step forward. Trotsky argued quite differently. He thought he could summarize in the following terms the lesson of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. "The generation which conquered the power, the old guard, will begin the work of liquidating the state. The next generation will complete it." Unquote. If this miracle had not occurred, who could be to blame, if not the treacherous Stalinist bureaucracy? It may seem misleading to use philosophical categories to explain the history of Soviet Russia, but this approach is legitimized by Lenin himself, who quotes and subscribes to the excellent formula of Hegel's logic, according to which the universal must be such that it contains within itself the richness of the particular. In expressing himself thus, he is thinking above all of the revolutionary situation, which is always determined and which reaches the breaking point in the weak link in the chain in a particular country. The excellent formula, on the other hand, by Lenin and the Bolshevik ruling group, was not designed for the phase following the conquest of power. When faced with the problem of a construction of a new society, the attempt to make the universal embrace the richness of the particular clashed with the accusation of betrayal. And it is well understood that this accusation particularly affected Stalin, longer than any other leader. He governed the country that had sprung from the October Revolution, and precisely from his experience of government, he realized the hollowness of the messianic expectations of the disappearance of the state, of nations, of religion, of the market, of money, and he also directly experienced the paralyzing effect of the vision of the universal inclined to brand as a contamination of attention paid to the particular needs and interests of a state, of a nation, of a family, of a particular individual. By the way, again, if you look at my reads that I've done, there's one called by DPRK called "On the Historical Lessons of Building Socialism," on the lessons of building socialism in the historical line of our party. DPRK also talks about this very thing, about the state as general terms, many put it, needing to continue on. In other words, human administration and organization. Not just needing to continue on, but will persist. Because, of course, remember, it's not down to us as individuals to determine how revolutionaries are playing out. All we can do is best understand the direction the masses are moving and get to the head of that and be able to help steer that away from the rocks and the fucking obstacles that will be in our path, right? To, oversimplify what the job of a vanguard is. It's not to create socialism from nothing. It's to steer this already demand for socialism, this already demand for fundamental difference, to steer that away from obstacles. Because that's the irresistible force that society is already being propelled in towards socialism, towards revolution. Okay, sorry. If it is true that ideology plays a significant role in the prolongation of the second time of troubles, it should, however, be pointed out that it calls into question Stalin's antagonists in particular. The latter, thanks also to the concrete experience of the government, seriously engaged in the learning process through which, according to Hegel's teaching, the leading group of a great revolution is forced to pass. That brings us to the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Next Thursday we'll be starting at least chapter 4, the complex and contradictory course of the Stalin era. Now we get really into the weeds of during the Stalin leadership.